is not legal or psychological advice. Listening does not create a professional relationship with Split Up or any guests. Lonnie and Robert are only licensed in the state of Arizona. For legal or mental health concerns, please consult a licensed professional in your state. Guest identities may be changed for privacy.
Hi, I'm Lonnie with Split Up, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about polarized opposite views in politics and when the child is caught in the middle. So we're going to try and help you kind of navigate your way through that. I'm going to be talking about it from the legal standpoint. Robert's going to be talking to you about it from the psychological standpoint and from the emotional standpoint. So, hi, Robert.
Hi.
All right. So you all know Robert is a forensic psychologist, and so he's going to kind of talk about that issue. So this is kind of a big one, and it's happening a lot right now. I've had cases dealing with it. I know Robert has had cases dealing with it, and it's when the parents have very opposite views of what's going on politically, and the kids get caught in the middle. Sometimes the parents want to explain to the kids. Sometimes the parents want to drag the kids in there with them. And so we're going to talk about that and what what the kids can be doing and what that feels like for the kids.
Yeah, that's right, Lonnie. And, when parents have beliefs that clash when they're on political opposite ends of the spectrum, or really with any major issue where there's a difference in values, children can often feel like they're being pulled in two different directions. So our goal today is really to help parents navigate these divides in ways that keep the focus really on the child's well-being.
All right, so we'll break down the conflicts and the legal and the psychological and give practical tips for it. I'm going to try and do this without getting my political views in there. And I'm sure Robert doesn't even show his hand at all. So I'm trying to be less political in this than he is, I think. So we're going to give a little an example, and this is going to be mom is Lisa, dad is Mark, and they have 50-50 custody of their 12-year-old son, Ethan. And Lisa leans progressive. She's passionate about environmental activism, social justice, and inclusivity. And Mark is conservative. He values tradition, personal responsibility, and smaller government. And so this is, they've got to kind of work this around Ethan. So Ethan came home. Lisa says that Ethan came home saying climate change isn't real. How can Mark tell him that? It's irresponsible. And Mark says every time Ethan comes back from Lisa's, he's talking about banning cars and protesting. She's brainwashing him. So go ahead, Robert. This one's on you.
Yeah, thanks, Lonnie, for that setup. And this is really such a common dynamic, again, where you have polar opposite views or differing values. Both parents really believe they're doing what's best for their child, but their disagreements are turning Ethan into basically a battleground. So I always like to, when I'm helping coach parents who are in conflictual co-parenting relationships, is to give a lot of education about what children are experiencing and what their developmental or cognitive tasks are across the age span and lifespan. And with Ethan, who's 12 years old, you've got a kid who is transitioning from late childhood to early adolescence. So the needs and tasks at these stages are really in the areas of cognitive, emotional, and social development. And what we know about kids in this age group is that they're really starting to develop and continuing to develop more abstract thinking. So they're more able to consider things like hypothetical situations and explore these what if scenarios that younger children aren't necessarily as capable or developmentally prepared to do. So oftentimes, fortunately or unfortunately, concepts like justice and fairness start coming into the mix, and they start viewing it in a more nuanced way. But this is also a really great age for learning problem solving and reasoning. So they're more able to use logic, solve problems, planning ahead, thinking through consequences of their actions. The downside to this is that their impulsivity controls aren't quite fully developed yet. So you have more, they still may struggle with that impulsivity. So what that can look like is a lot of passion when they're talking about things. At the same time, they're also developing more self-awareness and doing what we call metacognition, which is thinking about their own thought process. So they're thinking about organizational strategies in their mind and how to manage things. So you have all of these like really cool things going on developmentally. And now I want you to imagine that in the context of a high conflict co-parenting dilemma where you've got two parents who may have very different values and beliefs, and they may be sharing those beliefs and values with the child in really indirect ways, just through living their daily lives and just having those values sort of by osmosis transfer to the child. Or sometimes, unfortunately, in these situations, more strategic, targeted kind of value conversations that in some ways are going to overpower the other parent's values. And that's where we start to have to look at the co-parenting behaviors. So with that in mind, we really have to look at this from the perspective of what do we want to be teaching the child here? And my advocacy here would be around this is a great opportunity for teaching problem solving and critical thinking. So rather than turning the strategy into how do you quote unquote correct the narrative that you believe is untrue, that's being allegedly sort of influenced by your co-parent, is to teach the child how to think critically about any information that they're giving without undermining or belittling the other parent. And this will be valuable because you don't necessarily then have to keep it specific to if it's a political disagreement with mom and dad, it could apply to any area where they're consuming information, which in today's day and age, you have adolescents and even younger kids consuming social media where they may be getting value signals from all types of different sources. And you want to teach your child to be able to really digest that information, think critically about it without forcing their views because they are still exploring that independence and that autonomy. You're just going to be fighting uphill with them. And frankly, if you double down against the other parent, it'll probably just crystallize what they're believing anyway. And it'll be harder to teach those critical thinking skills. So those are just some preliminary thoughts I had, Lonnie.
Yeah, those are really great points because they really should be learning and exploring this on their own and or with the help of the parent, doing it in an appropriate way and not really being the mediator kind of between the parents and not having to sort of fight those battles back and forth.
Right.
Do you have any? I know I'm putting, so we have this, for those of you who don't know, we have this section that's like on the hot seat with Dr. D. And I like to at least do something to put him on the hot spot. And that's usually we try and do at the end. But I do have a question and I'm going to put you in the hot seat.
Let's do
So
it.
what are some ideas that you can give to parents to help them get the kids critically thinking on their own? Like what do you say to do it? You say for them to do it and to teach them, but how?
Well, I think it's helpful to even just think about how you might respond as an adult in a situation where you're disagreeing with whatever information you're looking at, which your reflex might be to say that's not true or that's not accurate. That's a very closed and limiting statement, especially for a child who's trying to understand and think and reason. So I would encourage the use of open-ended dialogue or sometimes even Socratic discussions, such as, tell me more about what you're thinking about those issues, or even, priming it with something positive. Like, that's a really interesting perspective. Tell me more about that. And starting with kind of an open-ended dialogue in that way and getting the child to talk about it more. And you don't even have to directly start challenging those things at this point. You're just getting them to start thinking and talking and really supporting their position with thinking through the particular issue. One of the things that may happen as they're talking it out loud together is that they find contradictions in their own narrative. And so it might be self-correcting in a way that they'll start challenging themselves. But even if it didn't, or even if the child does not do that, as the parent with maybe a different value set, you might even just propose, well, did you ever think about it from this perspective? And not forcing it, but just offering an alternative viewpoint or an alternative perspective. Again, if you are coming in hot with the perspective that your other parent is manipulating the child's thinking and brainwashing them, your responses are going to be aligned with that type of reaction. And so you really have to check yourself and lower your own defensiveness so that you can have a meaningful, relevant, logical conversation with your child.
All right, so let's kind of talk about what harm it can do to the child when the child is put in the middle like that. When you have two very, very different, you have a parent who was, and for lack of a better way to say this, involved in January 6th issue at the White House, or you have, in Washington, I should say, or you have somebody, the other parent who goes and all right, what am I thinking of? What word is it?
Like protesting.
The protesting. And so you've got these very different viewpoints. You've got one that's really taking some very strong measures in one direction, one that's taking some very strong measures in the other direction. What is that going to do to the child?
Well, without the ingredient of the conflict, it might not do anything other than what it would do if they saw the information in a different format through social media or the news. But if you have parents sort of conflicting over these value-based behaviors like protesting versus not, it could lead to some confusion for the child. Ethan in this example would be hearing two conflicting narratives and doesn't know which one to believe. So that creates confusion, but also just tension in thinking. And when we have what we call cognitive dissonance, when two things don't quite match up, it does promote us to think sometimes about ways to reconcile those discrepancies. We just don't know if it's always going to land in an area that's going to be healthy or unhealthy. But I'd say the bigger risk here is when children feel pressure to choose sides or agree with a parent. And that can look one of two ways. You can have the child acquiesce and agree to the parent just so they don't have to hear the narrative anymore, which is not helpful communication, and it could strain the quality of the parent-child relationship. Or they can outright be resistant and start rejecting narratives and beliefs and values of the other parent to the detriment of that relationship. And so we're putting the child in this position of having to agree or disagree with parents. And they're going to learn those tools throughout their lifespan in terms of, agreeing or disagreeing with anybody in their lives. We're looking at how is that going to impact the quality of the parent-child relationship. So, the other secondary potential areas of concern would be developing things like anxiety or stress response, the constant exposure to mom and dad's conflicting views, depending on how, like strongly they're laying those on. He could feel like he has to take responsibility for taking care of his parents and their anger and their frustration about each other. And so that could promote a lot of anxiety and stress for the child.
All right, so let's say, because I think this can be done in a healthy way, and I'm hopeful you'll agree with me, but maybe it just can't be. I don't know. Let's say in this case, Dad takes Ethan to a political protest, such as the January 6th Washington issue, and he takes Ethan there and explains to him what he's doing and why he's doing it. Alternatively, mom takes Ethan to a different protest and also explains to him why she's doing it and what the issues are. Is there a healthy way to get your child involved in both? I guess the question is, we don't want dad calling mom names. But when you're at a protest like that, there might be some name calling, there might be some bashing of the other side. And so I guess if you have people with two totally different views, is it possible to get the children involved? Can mom get the child involved in her side? Can dad get the child involved in his side without just messing up the kid, like without just really causing him, anxiety or emotional trauma?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, that's a great question, Lonnie. And I think, this really comes down to the messaging and how you package it to the child. professionals like myself are not or should not be in the business of micromanaging parents and families' values. Those are theirs, and they can raise their children how they see fit. And I don't believe professionals really have a say in that. And as long as the child is being treated in a way that's healthy and not abusive. So on that point, we do have to consider, what are we exposing the child to, and does that create a safety concern? So something like a political protest or any sort of emotionally charged event where there could be retaliation, either directly or indirectly, that falls upon the child, that becomes a safety issue. And so we do have to prioritize that before anything. But holding that constant and just assuming, for the sake of this thought experiment, that it's a safe environment in both conditions, whether it's mom taking the child or the dad taking the child or either parent. Really, the issue is the child perceiving going with one parent or the other to the detriment of the other parent? And so if mom and dad are spatting and disputing over these issues, let's say child goes with dad, they may have some guilt and feelings of insecurity about going with that parent because of the narrative created by the other parent, which is dad's wrong or mom's wrong, as opposed to, this is an opportunity, again, to explore your own thinking. Nobody's forcing you to take a side on this, but these are dad's values and these are mom's values. And ultimately, I think there's potential for health, sort of a healthy outcome there, which is the child gets to see multiple perspectives, multiple vantage points. And as they approach later developmental stages, like late teenhood, when these ideas start to become more solidified, and then into early adulthood, they can make their own choices. And mom and dad should be proud of that. If the child is, finding their own way, developing their own values, that may be a healthy balance between both parents' value sets.
All right. So in our family law courts, the only way I can really get really in front of the court, I mean, of course, if you have something in your parenting plan that says, no talking negative about the other parent, keep your political ideologies to yourself, kind of thing, or at least don't push them, extremely on your kids. Unless there's something really significant like that, then it comes down to if it's harming the kids. Now, let's say that there is something in the parenting plan. Let's say that you do have words in there because you knew this was an issue. Possibly this was the reason you got divorced, and both of you want to keep the kids out of the middle, which was a great thought and a great plan. But maybe one or the other of the parents is struggling with that plan because they're so adamant about their beliefs. Then the issue is, if they've violated the order, can we go in and get contempt issues?
Yeah, and those are. Oh, go ahead. I was just going to comment, when you have that type of language in the parenting plan, it seems really practical and feasible. The rub here is that you're not always going to know in instances of like indirect exposure. So the example that comes to mind is mom's watching something on the news and has sort of a reaction to that and says it out loud in front of the child, like, oh, that particular political figure is such an idiot, right? And the child hears that. They go back to the other parent, dad, and say, mom really hates so-and-so, and she's really angry about this or that. And dad immediately interprets that as mom is bad-mouthing, mom is creating, these huge value discrepancies. And it could have just been an off-the-cuff thing. And so I think parents become really highly reactive and sensitive to these issues. And you don't always know what happens between an information exposure point and how that messaging gets back to the other parent. So how that parent who's sort of experiencing the child in that condition might benefit from keeping multiple hypotheses and certainly like multiple perspectives open about, is this exactly what happened? Because it will change the way they respond. And when we do have more concrete examples, like perhaps a parent taking a child to a political rally without approval and it's against the parenting plan, then we need to, look at more legal strategies that's more on your side of the fence. But at least from my perspective, those things should be documented.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the documentation. Look, I'm document, but that was a really interesting point because just like if you saw something on TV, you know, the kids might be at a party, a graduation, an extracurricular activity, and there might be other people talking, or mom talking to somebody, or dad talking to somebody, and, calling someone a snowflake or garbage, or, whatever their words are now, for each side. And so, you're right. It may not even be the other parent that's doing it. The other parent might not be shielding from it, but they might not actually be the people doing it. And so in those cases, and again, I'm big on documenting, write a letter, write an email to the other party, make it kind, make it appropriate, use the BIF method, and write the letter and say, hey, this is what Ethan came and said to me, and I'm a little concerned, one, that maybe it's a violation of the parenting plan, but two, I want to make sure that we're keeping Ethan out of these things. We both recognize that we have different views. What can we do? I always like this. I always like to ask the other party to solve the problem. What can we do to, make sure that we kind of keep him out of the middle? Do you have any suggestions? And then hopefully that helps. If it doesn't help, if you get a nasty message back, or a mind your own business back, or screw you back, you've now shown the court, you've got this piece of paper and this evidence that you've now shown the court that you're able to communicate appropriately, that you attempted to communicate appropriately, and that this other parent is not communicating appropriately and is not putting the child's best interest first. And so it's a win-win. Either it works, or you've got evidence that it doesn't work. And so I like to keep my clients doing that. But as far as going to court, when there has been a violation, and let's say you've written the letter and it hasn't helped and nothing's helping, then I think it's important to know that, first, know your audience. Is this judge politically aligned with you or your partner, your ex? Because that can matter. We all have biases, whether we want to believe that we do or don't. So if you are on the opposite side of the spectrum as the judge, they're not supposed to bring these biases to court. Sometimes they do. Just make sure you have good evidence. Make sure that if they want to find one way, like against you, you have enough evidence on your side. Two, sadly, there's a lot of things written in parenting plans that just, get violated. And I know it's there, and parents are like, well, then why is it even written? I think a lot of times we write things in there with the hope that it'll discourage the other parent from violating it, and with the understanding that they wrote this stating that this was in the child's best interest. So when they signed this, they have to, basically say, this is in my child's best interest, and that's why I'm signing it. And so if they are going against that, then they are going against what's in the child's best interest. Again, the problem is, so what? So like, what happens if they violate? And that's where it becomes a totally different issue, and start, writing down take notes on what's happened, take notes on what your child's saying. And if it gets to the point where there's harm, and Robert's going to talk about that, if it gets to the point where there's actual harm, then you can probably take it to court, and you might be able to modify or do something to intervene. So that brings me to my next question for you, Robert. What does actual harm look like? If Robert tells me what harm looks like, then it's going to be my job or your job then to take that to the court and say, clearly this is harming the child and this is why, and possibly even bring in an expert on why it's harming the child. But Robert, what does harm mean in that context?
Yeah, so harm is a pretty general term, and I think we can look at it in terms of a legal statute. For example, abuse has a legal statutorial definition, and then we can just look at it simply from a psychological perspective, which is where I'm coming in. So I alluded earlier to, the different maybe intensities by which parents may convey their political views or any values that may differ from the other parent. Where we would see the most harm is when we see the parent disparaging or vilifying the beliefs of the other parent. Because the other parent believes X, Y, or Z, they're immoral, they're bad, they're harmful. These are the types of narratives that would fall within the realm of alienating behaviors, because you're directly, either intentionally or maybe naively, negatively impacting the child's relationship with that parent vis-a-vis their perspective of that parent. So we do want to avoid those types of alienating statements that vilify the other parent. That would be an example, a really concrete example of harm. Um, I would even extend that to exposing the child to really extremist or age inappropriate content. So as adults, we have to censor and monitor what information goes to our children. And if you're exposing them to really horrific, extreme things that a child of that age probably shouldn't be aware of. And again, I say that with some caution, because that's a subjective assessment, and it may be value-based as well. So we have to be cautious of that. How politically active do you want a 12-year-old? And again, that's going to depend on the family's values, which may differ across the households. But in general, when we expose them to really extreme material of any content, you're advancing their development in ways that might fall into what we call adultification. And that's where we adultify a child by giving them adult content, adult relationships, before they're emotionally and psychologically ready. So in those instances, parents really do need to document these with the same caution noted beforehand, which is sometimes children say things and you don't always know how the actual statement originated. And so you don't want to jump on any one single point. You want to look for themes. You want to look for an accumulation of events or comments, not just, the child perhaps overhearing mom or dad say something negative once or twice, because the parents are there's going to be spillover. The child's going to know their parents' value positions on a lot of things just through living with them.
So, okay, I'm putting you in the hot seat again, because it seems like every time you talk, then I have more questions. So let's talk about the adultification. What is that, and why is it bad?
So, as I mentioned earlier, when this process or dynamic of adultification, some examples, concrete examples that I can think of would be exposing your child to adult content, such as court information. So let's say mom or dad was really stressed with how the divorce litigation was playing out, and they sat their child down and started showing them legal documents or court filings or financial records. These are things that kids don't have really any business or desire knowing about unless they begin advocating for that parent. And I would describe that as a role enmeshment or a role corruption. It moves beyond the typical parent-child relationship and sort of shifts the child into an adult-like role. You can just compare it to, would this be content that a parent would be sharing with a really close friend or their attorney? If you're sharing that same content with the child, then the answer is yes, you're probably engaging in some level of adultifying the child. And again, the reason this is problematic is the child, based on their age and development, is one, not emotionally, cognitively, psychologically equipped to understand and engage with that content in an appropriate manner, like an adult might be that has life experience and other contextual information, because you can bet that child's getting a one-sided perspective, and it's not going to be with the full context for them to make really, truly critically thought out opinions about it. But beyond that, you're engaging them in litigation. You're putting them in a loyalty conflict with that parent. And so it is, again, in the spectrum of alienating type behaviors that we sometimes see in these cases. But we want to keep children where they need to be, which is focused on their childhood, focused on their friends and peers, and managing and navigating these developmental tasks that they should be doing without all this extra noise in their life.
All right. Well, that makes sense. And I I want to talk to everyone about what to do if you're in the middle of a divorce right now or in the middle of a custody battle right now, and you're adding language to a parenting plan. I think it's if you've got parents that are going to protest and you're saying, let's not do that to our child right now. Let's wait till a certain age, or let's let the child decide, or let's never take the child to a protest until they're at least 18 and not within not being bound within the parenting plan. So you could write in there that both parents agree not to expose the child to inappropriate political discussions or content, but then what is inappropriate? So you may have to define that. Parents shall not disparage each other's beliefs in the child's presence. Again, it's different. Like Robert said earlier, is it hearing something on there? I can tell you I did something one time to my son, and I was not meaning to be mean at all to my ex, but somebody cut me off, and my son said, "Why don't you honk?" And I said, "Because that's not a nice thing to do." And I don't know if he went and told my ex, like maybe my ex went and honked at someone and he said that's not a nice thing to do. I don't know how that broke down other than I got a phone call. So I wasn't meaning to do anything negative against him. I was just, my own belief was that, and it was never meant to say anything negative or towards my ex, but my son took it that way. And so you need to kind of keep track of that too, because whether it's agreeing with what's on TV or whether it's a conversation with parents or friends, the kids are picking up on it, and they make that connection. They make the connection from, you don't like this, dad likes this, and now you're anti-dad. And it had never been anything like that. I just wasn't going to honk at someone. And so just keep that in mind too. Again, like Robert said, it may not be a direct insult or a statement against that other parent, but it may be taken that way by the kids because they don't have necessarily the experience to understand that just because you say something, it's not necessarily bad against somebody else. So again, put that in your parenting plan if you want something in there. But again, you have words like age appropriate, and maybe age appropriate or age inappropriate is not well defined, and at what age. So do you want to define that more? Also, maybe just say, neither party will take the child to a protest. And that in and of itself is, I think, probably enough for that. So, Robert, is when kids do sort of pick up on that and sort of, like I was saying, kind of jump to the other parent, what do you have like for suggestions for that? Because I certainly wasn't trying to be mean against him, but it obviously was taken that way. So do you have any input on that? Not that I want to put my world in, like let you like rip me apart, but go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I did have a thought while you were talking about that, Lonnie, and I want to remind listeners who are co-parents, especially, you always have opportunities to course correct. And those are the teaching moments. So in your example, Lonnie, if you had gone back to your son and mentioned something like, hey, remember the other day when I said that if you honk, or I implied that honking is a bad thing to do, I maybe spoke too abruptly or quickly on that. Like there's lots of times when honking might be appropriate. And the reason that would be helpful is depending on the child's age. As I mentioned before, this 12-year-old in our previous example is moving from more concrete levels of thinking to higher levels of abstraction. So in younger children where you have that highly concrete thinking, things are very black and white. And by the way, that comes back to some degree as teenagers. But that concrete thinking could lead to, okay, if the conditions exist in this particular setting, then it exists in all settings. So of course, when dad honks the horn, he's being bad. So again, you're encouraging this critical thinking by circling back and readdressing issues where you might have made mistakes, even innocent sort of inadvertent ones, right? Encourage them to talk about these issues. What do you think about that? Why do some people see it differently? And of course, this links back to our discussion on politics. You're encouraging the process of critical thinking. Again, keeping in mind the child's age and development, because that's going to determine how much content to give them and the appropriateness of that content. We're not going to give a 7-year-old, pictures and images of terrible atrocities happening around the world to develop anxiety, even under the guise of, hey, I want to prepare my kid for the world. You have to ground it in where your child is developmentally. The other tip I would suggest is really focusing on shared values across the household. So, what's the common ground? What were your values during the marriage that probably neither of you would dispute at this point, like fairness, honesty, importance of family, sort of the high level values. But you can get a little bit more granular even in the specific values. If the family cares about people and their rights, and parents are arguing that from different perspectives, you can still find common ground in advocating and standing up for people, supporting the underdog. Those are values, but they're not so specific that you have to take a side on who the underdog is or who the perpetrator is, right? And you want to model throughout all of this respectful disagreement. You've got to be able to show your child that it's okay to disagree without attacking somebody. And what an amazing skill you can give to a child of any age to apply at all points in their life, not just in the particular disagreement. So those are some high-level tips, but certainly we'll provide more resources and tools throughout our app Split Up.
Right. So I agree with all of that. And your response to what I did was actually perfect. I wish I would have known that. I wish I would have, even now thinking back, thought, well, let me tell you why I'm not going to honk at them. Not just that it's not mean, but, because maybe it's an accident. Maybe it's this. Maybe I don't want to ruin their day. Maybe like 1,000 other reasons. And then come back and say, but it doesn't mean that you can't honk for some reasons, because there's lots of reasons to honk. That's why there's a horn built in the car. If you were never supposed to honk, then there wouldn't be a horn.
Well, Lonnie, I think parents too are just so hyper vigilant and sensitive to issues that they feel like going back and apologizing or re-correcting a narrative will somehow implicate them further. And I always encourage parents to really challenge that, because of course they're in the spotlight of family court and litigation, and everybody's using information and data to harm the other person or advocate for their needs, depending on which side you're on. But when you put the child's needs front and center, going back and correcting yourself when you make a mistake, it really models responsible behavior. It models taking ownership. There's so many added benefits and values to that.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of that. I like to take my, I'm willing to suck it up and say when I'm wrong, because I do want my kids to be able to say that, because nobody's perfect, and there's no reason why we should try and make our kids think that they need to be perfect. So if we can't come to a resolution, if there are issues, I would suggest that maybe court isn't the first line of defense. I think first you write the letter, but then second, if there's an issue, you try and mediate it. Maybe come up with language, come up with a plan together where, just like Robert said, you get to use information from, both sides, and like, what were you using? Empathy and fairness and the underdog. When you start using words like that in a mediation, you can oftentimes come to an agreement, especially if you have a creative mediator helping you do something like that. So I'm a big proponent, and even if it's not like a family law mediator, then have a friend who's very neutral help you come up with some wording. I think you have to assume, and I always try to at least assume this, both parties want what's best for the kids. Both parties want the best interest for the child. Sometimes they just don't get that what they're doing is harmful to the child. And sometimes they dig their heels in and don't want to admit that what they're doing is not in the best interest of the child. And that's kind of where a neutral third party can come in, because you're not going to believe your ex has good intentions. You always, it seems like people very often, until the kids are 18, you're almost like gathering evidence for the next issue to use against them. So instead of, like Robert said, admitting that you've done something wrong, you don't want to do that because you're going to go to court. And if you go to court, that's going to be used against you. And so the mediation is a good area to kind of go, that get a neutral third party, a friend. We all have that one friend who's super neutral, who's super good at, seeing both sides of the story, even when you can't. So my suggestion there is mediation first. And then if you have to go to court, make sure you have your evidence, and just understand that, know what you want. Is what you want different language? Is what you want your ex following the order? What if they don't again? How are you going to remedy this? Ask the court for what you want. If you want a financial penalty, ask the court for a financial penalty. We had one judge who, if somebody cussed in emails, would charge them, the other parent could bring the emails back and they would charge them like $20 a cuss word or something, or $20 a put down. You can get creative. Not all judges are willing to do that. Some are. I think that's great. So, Robert, do you have anything to add to that part?
It just makes me laugh. I imagined a scenario in which, everybody has to bring their attorneys into court to litigate the issue of emails, and assigning fees and fines when they're probably spending thousands of dollars on their attorneys. So it highlights, I think, for me, the absurdity of some of these arguments. And some of the advice I give to co-parents I work with a lot of the times is pick your battles, like what hill do you want to die on? There are some issues that are going to be really important to you because they're value-based and maybe impact really important parts of your life. And those are the things you want to really focus on. And then some of the day-to-day minutia that might just be annoyances, you might decide to let go and not put so much energy into litigating those issues, or even bringing them up to your co-parent if you can live with the consequences of that. And in a way, you're deflating the other parent's activity as well by not engaging. So there's added benefits there.
Yeah, and by the way, if anyone is having issues with what a parent is writing, there is a program called ProperCom that edits emails and text messages to remove any of the abuse. So there is that possibility. There's also other apps that you can use that will have a tone meter. They won't take it out. So if somebody doesn't care about the tone meter, it doesn't matter, but somebody might care. Sometimes people communicate badly just because they don't know how else to communicate. So, what are like long-term strategies that, Robert, that you think that we could do, that we think that we could kind of do with our kids to make sure that they don't get involved or really put in the middle of that?
I would say the first one relates back to what we've already discussed, and that's, rather than trying to find some sort of resolution or even a position that you and your child both agree on, is focusing on managing the conflict. You really have to accept that there will probably not be an agreement with regard to you and your co-parent in terms of the value positions, right? Like that might be one of the reasons you're no longer together. So how you manage conflict is going to be really important without so much emphasis on resolving a particular issue or fight. And accepting just some level of conflict is going to exist in your co-parenting relationship, just as it exists in all of your interpersonal relationships. We're not trying to avoid or bury our head in the sands from conflict. We have to learn how to manage it better. And then this is sort of an echo to everything we talk about, but really prioritizing the children's well-being. Ask yourself always, is this what's best for my child? Or am I trying to win here? Or am I trying to dominate the perspective? But, if those things aren't, if those things don't come easily to you, there's always professional help. There's psychologists and counselors and mental health professionals that are forensically informed that can help give you coaching and guidance. You could do family counseling and co-parenting therapy together with your co-parent to help, have some sort of venue for discussing these things on a more regular basis. So you're dealing with problems proactively rather than when a conflict arises. That can be hugely beneficial. And then, of course, any other resources and even split up and utilizing psychoeducation can be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the biggest part is putting the kids first and understanding that they're kids. They're not thinking the same way parents are thinking. They are different. They're kids. Their brains aren't fully developed. And because I think that parents try to put their kids first, and I think they're trying to do what's in the best interest in most cases. And I think sometimes they just lose thought of that. And they feel a sense of urgency, especially in politics, right? I think there's this sense of urgency right now developing where it's not a time to baby anyone. It's a time to I think parents are thinking it's a time to really make sure that our kids are learning because of how our country sits at this point and such the polar opposites. So again, we do have the down split up. If you have any other questions, we do live sessions. So if there's something that you're interested in that we haven't talked about, or if you have questions about these things, feel free to reach out to us. And then we have the Facebook page for subscribers, for premium subscribers. So you can always ask the questions there also. So thank you, Robert. I appreciate you being here. And as always, I love doing this with you.
Yeah, thanks, Lonnie. Likewise.